Thanks. First, of course, thank you so much to the VU for inviting me. First, it was with some trepidation that I accepted the invitation because it's, I'm an outsider in the world of conspiracy theory. Yuda has been doing very good work in dragging me in. And we meet almost weekly. We have this reading group and we usually dance, which has the time. And so that's why I've been getting interested in conspiracy theory, not only because I'm here more generally, but of course I'm here, all of you here probably know about the literature of conspiracy theories much more than I do. What I'll try to do here is present this general framework for belief forming processes that I've been developing together with my team here at the group and see how this general framework helps to kind of shed light perhaps on some of the issues about conspiracy theories that many of you have been thinking about. Right? So that's I really hope to be able to kind of contribute something to the debate in this way. So I'm here, in a very humble position as right. So there's been a lot of focus, as far as I know, on this question of how conspiratorial beliefs spread. Right? So this is very much, it's even taken to be like a societal problem, right? That there's this spread of conspiratorial beliefs and it's leading to all kinds of societal problems. So, a lot of people, including social psychologists, sociologists, political scientists, philosophers have looked into this issue. And kind of the way I phrase what the problem is here, or the question is that when the circuits of attention and trust, they are rewired in a way that I will explain during the talk, this is what allows people to be exposed to and then become convinced by such beliefs. And the observation here, which will inspire a lot of my talk, is that these adopters of conspiratorial beliefs may well be following roughly the same belief-forming processes and strategies that lead to so-called good, well-founded beliefs. This idea that I borrow from New Levy, who was just mentioned in the previous talk. And so there's a sense in which, he says, well, the processes that lead to bad beliefs are not that different from those that lead to good beliefs. I think that's a very interesting thought to explore, right, in the context of thinking about conspiracy theories. And another point from New that I take on, but then I disagree with him on other things, is the idea that of epistemic environments, what really will lead to either good or bad beliefs is to a large extent the epistemic environment you find yourself in. And the point is that epistemic environments, they be engineered both to promote, let's say, false conspiratorial beliefs, but also to hide real conspiracies. So these are really two sides of the same coin, right? So there's if you're thinking about it, conspiracy theories, you also need to think about the opposite of it, right? How is it that actual conspiracies, in fact, don't come to the surface, as it were? And I'll basically say, well, it's the framework to think about these processes can be the exact same one. So I'll tell you a little bit about living on bad beliefs. Then I'll talk about this what I call the three-tiered model of belief-forming processes, which has these three levels: attention, trust, and then engagement. Then talk about how conspiratorial beliefs spread according to this model, but then also how real conspiracies hide also following this model, right? And I realize, of course, the choice of terminology here is very sensitive, right? Should we use conspiratorial beliefs? Should we use conspiracy theories? You've written on that, right, Julia? Should we use the term conspiracy? So I realize that there's a lot of discussion. Of course, we are philosophers, so we like to, worry about minutiae of uses of vocabulary. So, I'll be a little bit kind of flexible in my use of this vocabulary, but, I hope you understand where I'm going. I mean, I'm not going to get into the discussions of how best to understand each of these terms, okay? Right, so what does New Levy say about bad beliefs? So he talks about polluted environments, and I thought this was very kind of visually polluted as an epistemic environment. Right, so he has this book called Bad Beliefs. And what are bad beliefs for him? These are widespread beliefs that are at odds with expert consensus and or available scientific evidence. Of course, immediately we get into the problem of expertise and expert consensus analysis. Some examples of bad beliefs are climate change denialism, vaccine skepticism as standing examples in the sense that they are at odds with our best scientific views. And but then he says, those who come to hold bad beliefs do so for roughly the same sorts of reasons as those who come to hold good beliefs. Right? So the whole point of the book is to say that there's a sense in which is to say those holding bad beliefs are also rational, because the basis of the evidence that they have, they reason in the same way roughly as the people who come to good beliefs. As I said, I disagree with some of the details of his account, but I find the general idea interesting. And what are these reasons? For him, he really very much emphasizes deference as the primary epistemic mechanism, principle for agents in epistemic communities. Right? So these are tried and tested mechanisms for social learning, according to Levy, and he says that by and large they work. I don't know whether you have to call me that, but okay. Right? So then what he says is that bad believers are responding rationally to a subpar epistemic environment, that is an epistemic environment that is polluted. So that's his story. Okay. So this is like specifically about bad beliefs, but the book more broadly offers this account of belief forming processes that emphasizes the role of social, cultural, and material environments. So you have some quotes from him. Given that we're epistemically social animals, it's largely through deference that we come to know about the world and generate further knowledge. We agree with that. We're social and cultural animals, and we respond to the genuine evidence that our fellows and our cultural environment provide to us. I'm also completely on board with that. Okay, so this is really come to emphasize this idea of the social nature of knowledge culture, right, and of our epistemic groups. So he has this really interesting idea. Now, in many of the talks so far today, I really thought, well, this is really what's going on, and I think it's useful to bring this distinction to the table, this idea of higher order evidence, which of course has come up in various talks today already, but the way he formulates it, he really wants to use the social cues as higher order evidence. And in a sense, his project can be understood as a project of epistemic purism. Right? So he wants to have an account of these processes that really are purely epistemic. And the trick here is that to look at some factors that in other theories would come out as non-epistemic, like social, having to do with like identity and all this. And he says, well, you can also view these factors as epistemic, as evidence after all. It's just that is higher order evidence. And here's what he says. The higher order evidence is evidence that concerns not the issues about which we're trying to make minds, but the reliability of first order evidence and how other people are responding to that evidence. Cultural and social cues that are essential to human flourishing and to knowledge production themselves work through the provision of higher order evidence. We orient ourselves and make decisions centrally by reference to higher order evidence. And this too, I also very much endorse. I think that this whole kind of primacy of first order evidence that we see a lot in the epistemological literature, I think it's just misguided. I think by and large, we're relying on higher order evidence to come to decisions and make up our minds on a number of problems. Where Levy and I part ways is that he thinks we're pretty good at evaluating high order evidence accurately, and I don't think we are, precisely for the issues you were pointing out. There's no such thing as a marker of expertise that it's very easy to manipulate and weaponize markers of expertise. I'll get to that. So I have this commentary on Levy's book, which came out this year, where I kind of spell out some of the details of what I'll be telling you here today, but also my disagreements with Levy. So for those of you who want to see more details of how we part ways, it's over here. Okay, so now I move to the three-tiered model of belief forming processes, which is something that I initially developed specifically to think about argumentation, but actually it's much more general and it kind of covers epistemic processes very generally. So the key idea is to think about the notion of epistemic exchanges. Right? So when we're learning from other people and teaching them stuff, you can conceptualize these processes as instances of exchanges, and what in particular we're exchanging epistemic resources, and this is why they are epistemic exchanges. And right, so we we learn much of what we know from others. That's what also what Levi just said, it's by mechanisms of deference. But so you can think about them as exchanges, and what's the novelty here? It's that it's really viewed as this two-way street process, right? Normally you would think, if I'm learning something from Julia, which I often do, it's passive, she's teaching me something and I'm getting it, right? So there's like this one directionality. Whereas the exchange perspective really takes into account how things are going back and forth, epistemic resources are going back and forth around between us. Okay, so that's kind of the key idea. And on the basis of this idea, and inspired by this framework called social exchange theory, which comes from social psychology and sociology. It's a very old framework. It was developed already in the 1960s. It's been around for a long time. It's been used for a lot of also experimental work and empirical work. It's also inspired by anthropology. So, it's a very established framework in these fields. And then inspired by this literature, we developed this kind of model which has these three layers, which isolates, as it were, three aspects of these processes of exchange that we think are worth, at least conceptually separating from each other. In practice, the processes themselves, they take place very much in the form of feedback loops. But for theoretical purposes, it's useful to separate. First of all, there's the idea of the networks that determine who I can possibly exchange with, who are my potential exchange partners. And this has to do with the networks of opportunities. Then within the agents with whom I could potentially exchange, I will make contrastive choices. I will see who I think is more worth exchanging with than somebody else. Of course, this is presupposing situations where you have more than one choice. Sometimes you won't have more than one choice, but in many cases you will. And then you're just making these assessments of who's the better bet here, right? So, and this is gonna be very much in terms of what you think the other person has to offer, but very fundamentally, it's about trust. So we go back again to the point about trust. So this literature from social exchange theory has a lot of really, really interesting discussions on trust specifically. And then the third level is really when the actual exchange happens. And why is it distinguished from the previous one? Because when I'm making these assessments of who's worth exchanging with, I may still end up with more potential agents that I can actually go on and exchange with, or limitations of time or cognitive resources or whatever. So there's still this narrowing of the range of possibilities that I was considering at first. So here's these two pictures that I'm even tired of seeing them. And every single talk I get, they're there, but they're kind of useful. So the first one, right? So imagine, for example, to make it concrete, imagine that there's, well, of course, I'm representing just the main agent in the middle and the other people around. But obviously the networks are much more complex than that, right? It's really multiple agents, that are related to each other in multiple complex ways. But for simplicity, we just have this main agent in the middle. Imagine that this main agent in the middle is a newspaper reader. And imagine that all these little circles around are the pulse of the newspapers, in the world, okay? So first of all, there is here the range, the network of possibilities. So these are the newspapers that I'm aware of, that I know exist, right? So these are in my picture, newspapers A, B, C, E, and F, say. I'm not even aware that newspapers D and G exist. So they're not potential exchange partners for me, right? These newspapers, because I don't even know about that. There's no path between us, okay? Among these newspapers that I'm aware of, some of them I'll think are really not worth spending my time on, right? I really think they're trash, or they just publish lies or whatever. These are my picture, these are newspapers A and E. I'm look, I'm not even gonna bother, okay? Don't know, tabloids, right, or something like that. And then there are three newspapers that I still think, they're okay. I think they're reliable enough, above a certain threshold. But still, I'm not going to go and read all of them because the day has 24 hours, as there are other things to do. So then, suppose that in the end, even though I think newspaper F is okay, I could read it. I actually don't, and then I go and read B and C, for example. So that would be the idea that I end up reading, The Guardian, and I don't know, some other newspaper. And then, for example, like the New York Times, I think it's kind of okay, but it's not like, among other things, because it's very annoyingly paywalled everywhere. So I just got, but I think it's above a certain threshold, could be a potential. Not that it doesn't have its problems, by the way, right? The New York Times has very weird opinion writers, like it's not getting into the details of that, but I guess no newspaper is perfect. So these three tiers can be conceived of in terms of set containments, right? So in a sense, for the larger tier, these are like, this is like all the potential exchange partners that you have. Then a subset of that will be the tier two, the exchange partners who you think are worth exchanging with, at least worth considering exchanging with. And then a subset of that will be the actual exchanges. And of course, these subsets can be proper or not, right? It will depend, but typically they will be. There'll be more options than what you're actually going to go on and implement in terms of exchanges. So this is the very brief presentation of the general framework. The details are in this paper of mine. It was published already 3 years ago by now. And it also has the details of how this model emerges from social exchange theory. So if you want the details, it's in this paper. All right, so now remember that I said that one thing that I think is very useful from the bad beliefs book is the idea that the social cues can be understood as high order evidence. Right? How do we bring this? How do we mix this with my point about attention and trust in these epistemic processes? So one thing that's quite natural is the idea that both attention and trust are in some way or another related to these social cues that are that can be viewed as high order. Yeah, so that seems plausible enough, and that and I argue more detail for this in my critical notice on Neil's book. So, for example, for attention, well, how does that work? So on the one hand, the information that my social and material environment makes salient to me is probably important. Right? That seems like a fair enough, observation. Why is that? Well, first of all, maybe, for example, the things about my material environment that are salient to me, are the things about my material environment that I need to negotiate with on a daily basis, right, to navigate the world. So, for example, I don't need to survive navigating the world, I don't need to be seeing quantum properties, thankfully. Imagine, mind-blowing. Right? They're there, but I don't, they're not made salient to me because they're not relevant for how I navigate the world. That's in terms of the material physical world, but also socially that seems to be the case. Because, for example, the information that's salient to me in my epistemic environment is also likely the same information that my close peers are exposed to. And these are the people I need to coordinate with in these social epistemic processes, right? So it's convenient that we kind of know about the same things, that we're paying attention to the same things, because these are the things that will become relevant in how we coordinate in our process, in our social processes. But of course, when there are many cues, when cues are plentiful, what will happen is that the different sources, the different signals will be competing for attention. And this, of course, is the well-known and hyped notion of the attention economy. Right? So that's really the story about attention counting higher order evidence. It's like, it seems fine to some extent, but then you realize that there's when there are a lot of signals, you kind of get overwhelmed, and of course, these different signals will be competing for the agent's attention. And of course, the point is this process is very easily manipulable. I think that's already anticipating some of the stuff that I'll say later. And it's especially in these environments where cues are plentiful, then you really, as an agent, you have the burden of having to curate how your informational regime, your attentional regime, what you pay attention to. So to give a very concrete example, you need to be selective on who you follow on Twitter, right? Because if you follow too many people, it's going to happen that the stuff that you're really interested in is not going to come up in your feed. Of course, I know Twitter is dead now. I'm talking about in the good old days when Twitter was still a nice place, a virtual nice place to be at. But the point is, like, for example, I never followed a lot of people on Twitter because I'm like, if I follow like, 8,000 people, it's just that the stuff that I'm really interested in is going to drown, right? So this is the idea of curation of your attention regime becomes really important, and that, of course, to some extent, something that the individual will do. Of course, then there's the question about like how algorithms are interfering with that. A whole different discussion there. What about trust? Oh, by the way, and attention is something that now we're starting to get more traction within social epistemology. Right? For a long time, this just wasn't very much discussed. Philosophers of mind have been talking about attention for a little while, but in social epistemology, it's not just starting to pick up. By contrast, trust in social epistemology has been one of the most discussed topics in social epistemology of the last decades, in particular with respect to the notion of testimony. So in that sense, this is nothing particularly new, but now this is where I'm coming in and kind of adding, it's not obviously not coming from me, but I think it's important to distinguish at least two dimensions of the notion of trust. And that's the dimension of competence, and that's in the other dimension of the dimension of benevolence. And different people talk about, like, for example, Bernard Williams talk about competence and sincerity, but I think it's not just a matter of sincerity, it's really a matter of what I call benevolence, which has to do with how aligned your interests are with somebody when you're evaluating how trustworthy they can be. And for somebody to count as trustworthy, for example, an expert, both criteria need to be met to obtain. And that's why I said, it's kind of an answer to your question before to Melina, which is that, and I think also the points that Charles was making, an expert can be extremely competent, but you actually doubt their integrity, their benevolence towards you. For all you know, they're really trying to screw you over, right? And so that's why I think it's very important. It's really been missing because there's this a tendency to over-epistemicize the issue of expertise when it also has this really important moral component that tends to be overlooked. Not everybody overlooks it, of course. But anyway, so drawing this distinction between competence and benevolence, then you have the question of markers of expertise and competence, is the usual things, recognition, professional standing. Again, you were talking about some of them, Melina. But the point was, of course, they're not foolproof. Like there are a lot of mistakes that can happen there, and there's a lot of misleading higher order information that can be added there. And markers of benevolence would be things like social identity, group belonging, absence of competing interests, and things like that. And this is also that can also be mistakes in evaluations of, how benevolent somebody is towards you or not. Okay? So, and the whole point is that these two dimensions are theoretically distinguished. But as a layperson, you're typically not in a good position to disentangle them. And there's a paper by Heiduif, who used to be my postdoc here at the VU, who makes exactly this point, like with a mathematical model, he shows that actually, as a layperson, you're not in a position to distinguish between, if you disagree with an expert, you don't know if it's because they're more competent than you, or if it's because they're not their interests are not aligned with your interests. So in a way, it means we're screwed, right? Because it's really hard to trust experts because of that. And of course, why is this relevant for the conspiracy theory literature? Because many of those people who hold conspiratorial beliefs, what the people they don't want to believe, say the mainstream purveyors of information, it's on the account of benevolence or the lack thereof that they see them as untrustworthy. Not so much about competence, but it's political, it's moral. Okay, so now we go to the conspiracy theory part of the talk, but I still have 20 minutes, right? So I thought about 45 minutes.
So it's 10 past here. So if you've got 15 minutes of talk time, then you've got 20 minutes.
Yeah, it should be fine. Because now this is the part that I couldn't go quickly because all of you know this literature back and forth, right? It's just to show how the framework I was presenting, the concepts I was presenting before, can be useful to think about phenomena pertaining to, the realm of conspiracy theories. So, first of all, remember I said, I have this model with these three layers. The first one has to do with attentional networks. So this is a thing that's really, it's almost trivial. So you often don't see this observation being made, but it's very important. for conspiratorial beliefs to spread, there needs to be suitable communication technologies for this, right? And this is obviously that's why now with the internet, it's much easier for these beliefs to spread. And here the example that I really like, and I'm actually familiar with this, there was this book, which in English is called The Hammer of Witches, which was a book written by this completely nutcase of a priest in the 15th century, which is all about how witches are everywhere and how, how evil they are and how they're gonna castrate men, and it was like really horrific and absurd. And the interesting thing is that the religious authorities of the time, they completely dismissed this. They're like, no, this is just, they're like records of them saying, no, this is all this is the result of the writer's own sexual obsessions, right? Rather than anything that has to do with the truth. Because apparently back then people believed in witches, but they didn't think much of it. So, witches, they're around and just minding their own business and living their lives. It's really this guy. And then he wrote this book. Well, not exactly this one. This is a modern edition of it. But the point is, it was a book because this happened exactly when the printing press was discovered in Europe. So this book could be sold as a book, and at the time it was the second best sold book other than the Bible, second only to the Bible. If it had been written 50 years before, it wouldn't have spread the same, because there was no printing press then for this to kind of take off, right? And before that, it was on manuscripts, which was, of course, very expensive, so people didn't have books easily available. So that's why you see the invention of the printing press. On the one hand, all of us were probably all book people, like, yes, great, right? On the other hand, it really had very tangible and not always pleasant social consequences. There's a sense in which all the religious wars in the 16th, 17th century are very much related to the invention of the printing press. So these technological changes, revolutions, you would even say, there's a lot of social, they're social consequences because they change how information circulates in a given epistemic environment. So fast forwarding many centuries, of course, all of you know, for QAnon, the drops were first disseminated on 4chan and 8chan, right? So there were these networks there were these platforms, they existed, but they were kind of like in the undergrounds of the internet, right? But one thing that happened, and again, I'm sure all of you know this better than me, is that this also made their way, the drops, right? This whole discussion, these beliefs about QAnon, these QAnon beliefs, they made it to the surface of the internet, as it were, by means of platforms such as YouTube, Facebook, Reddit, Twitter, etc. So it's really like you need to think about how these attentional networks are structured on the basis of the technologies that are available for the dissemination of information. So trust, this is pretty obvious, right? And it's very much about trust, like a lot of what's going on in conspiracy theories. From the start, it's about trust, because from the start, they're morally laden. And so there's this idea of secrecy, there are evil plans, so that somebody wants to do something, usually like powerful people, this is also a talk we had today. They want to bring about something, do something that will very likely damage some people or some group of people to favor the interests of the conspirators, right? So from the start, there's this idea of a clash of interests, right? And somebody doing something that will eventually harm others. So that's why, it's natural to see them as untrustworthy if you believe this, right? That they're really doing something to harm your personal interests. And as we know, of course, we work from Freud and others, that one of the factors very strongly associated with adoption of conspiratorial beliefs is generalized distrust towards institutions and also mainstream purveyors of information, like regular mainstream media, right? So legacy media, as it's called sometimes, scientists, etc., etc. So there's like distrust towards all of these people, and not so much on the competence dimension, but rather on the benevolence dimension or lack thereof. And the idea that they're really doing something that's going to be bad for us in their benefit, for their benefit. And also an interesting observation, like if you distinguish competence from benevolence, there's also the famous Hanlon's razor principle. Does everybody know what that is? As it says, don't attribute malice if stupidity would explain, right, whatever outcome. And yeah, I mean, this is a very deep truth about life. You know, and it really helps you in life. Before you get angry at people, like, no, they're just being incompetent. So I'm sorry to say, but this, I shouldn't say this in public. That's my attitude towards the HR. You're just kind of messing up and you're like, oh my God. It's in fact, it's not even incompetence. They're overwhelmed and overburdened. It really helps me kind of stay zen and get less angry at people. So I recommend. But of course, people holding conspiratorial beliefs, they do the opposite. They overestimate competence and attribute malice. And how do they overestimate competence? They really think that those people are so smart and so powerful that they're able to do these most amazing things, like develop a vaccine that contains a chip that will say, you know, where your location is. This is really an overestimation of the scientific knowledge involved there. Like, even if we wanted to do this, we can't, right? At least not yet. And finally, on the engagement level, there's something really interesting as well with respect to conspiracy theories, and this has already kind of been mentioned here and there today. I think, Em, you were also talking about this, right? So the idea that the kind of engagement of many conspiracy theories imply is gamified, right? There's some enjoyment, some entertainment, some fun involved in the process. And here are two articles on this, right? So this is by a game developer. This one was on the Washington Post. This one was, I think, on Wired. So it's really, so this is like not philosophers writing. Also, philosophers have been writing on this. So Levy has a recent paper on that. It's actually somebody who probably wrote specifically on this.
No.
But you were mentioning some of these ideas. So, you know, probably there are the people who have written on this. I'm not saying so anything new. I'm just telling you how this idea of the gamification component, how it fits into my whole scheme, and that's at the third level, the level of engagement. Right. So basically, QAnon is fun. Right. Oh yeah, the talk about narratives, right? In a sense, kind of fits the, yeah, exactly. Kind of fits this idea that there's something like, you know, playful about it. So, right, so QAnon this has been noted by many people. And of course, to what extent this generalizes to other conspiracy theories, that's of course a question, but I'm using QAnon as the, you know, because it's one of the most obvious examples these days. And for QAnon in particular, many people have noted this game-like feel that it has, right? So these mysterious clues that are dropped and people are encouraged to crack the puzzle, right? Figuring things out by themselves. There's also this social thing, like cracking cracking the cues together, right? And it seems that many of the same techniques that are used in alternate reality games, they really are, you know, so this guy here, Reed Berkovich, he is a game developer of alternate reality games. And he said, you know, when cues started to appear, I was like, my God, this is exactly what I do, right? The same techniques, the same ideas, principles, mechanisms. This is what he says, right, in the Washington Post article. When you figure it out yourself, you own it. You experience the thrill of discovery, the excitement of finding the rabbit hole and tumbling down it. That's what he said. And then a philosopher, T. Nguyen, has also been, I don't know if he has already a paper on this, but he's been talking, in any case, in this podcast interview with Ezra Klein, he talks quite a bit about this idea of conspiracy theories in relation also to his work on games. I don't know, that's his thing, of games. And he says the following: conspiracy theories fit inside your head. They're the right size for you, just like games are the right size for you to take some kind of action. If you believe in a conspiracy theory, now you have total intellectual agency. And of course, this connects as well with this topic of people feeling disempowered, right? Many of the people who then adopt conspiratorial beliefs are often people who are feeling disempowered. And, you know, by adopting these beliefs, they feel somehow more empowered, right? Disenfranchised. I mean, there's this whole literature on this as well. And I think, you know, this idea of agency, it's the agency at the right size, right? So if there's the COVID pandemic, this is like completely overwhelming. I have no control over it. It seems hopeless. like climate change, it's even worse. That's like, you get an existential angst from it. But then if you think, oh, it's just some people who are doing this, and if I topple them down, at least we'll be done with this, tragedy. That gives you much more of a sense of agency, of like being able to do something about your own misery. And this is easier than just say, look, it's beyond my control, there isn't much that I can do. Okay? All right, so now this is the part about how these conspiracy beliefs spread. But what about how real conspiracies are hidden? And here my claim is that this is something that this is new, right? This is stuff that I've done for this particular talk, so it's a bit more rough around the edges. And I'm curious to hear your views on this. But the thought really is that the same mechanisms, like the same general structure where you have attention, trust, and then engagement, this general model can also help us understand how real conspiracies can be hidden. So there's this idea that I mentioned at the beginning of engineered epistemic environments, right? So this idea that you really, you can change if you're in a sufficiently powerful position, you can change the epistemic environment so that you have some amount of control over what people do and what people see and what people come to believe and how people attribute trust to different sources. Yeah, I think, it's pretty much obvious that this fits well with particularism. And I know, and I have M here, but I guess this is fairly standard, right, the quotation. It's just that, of course, here I'll be preaching to the choir because it seems like almost everybody's a particularist here too. But in any case, I think that this general picture that I'm sketching fits quite well with particularism. Because it's really about, how the evidence is processed in each of the cases. So remember that Levy said that good beliefs and bad beliefs are formed roughly by the same mechanisms. There are similar responses, but then to different epistemic environments. He thinks that the bad beliefs arise because the environment is polluted. I think it's oversimplistic to put it this way, but okay. And the point is that epistemic environments can be engineered both to promote false conspiratorial beliefs and to hide real conspiracies. And this is where also one of my critiques of Levy is that it doesn't take into account sufficiently motivations that political actors can have to engineer the epistemic environment. So there's not enough politics in the book, isn't it? So the point is, and that's where something that Brian apparently also has written on, I should read, that there may be little evidence for conspiracy theory available in your epistemic environment due to the fact that the conspirators themselves are hiding the evidence. That's what it means, if you're moderately competent conspirator, that's it. So this is how you engineer the epistemic environment. So let's just run some examples of real conspiracies. Again, this audience probably knows about most of them. So the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, I recently watched the HBO series, liked it very much, although that too is supposed to be a conspiracy theory from the West to discredit the Soviet Union, apparently. But anyway, the story, at least in the documentary, but according to most sources, as I checked, is that the disaster was largely due to reactor design flaws. Right? There were also human mistakes, but the main factor was the reactor design flaws. And this was first, they were trying to cover that up, but eventually this emerged, that this was exposed. Another famous case is the secret medical experimentation on non-consenting participants. One of the most horrific cases is the so-called Tuskegee experiments. So with the syphilis patients, it's really a horrific story. Also, that's the one that is closer to my personal experience, is the idea that the fact that the United States government, in particular the CIA, were involved in establishing and maintaining military dictatorships in various Latin American countries during the Cold War. So I was born during a military dictatorship in Brazil. Right? And that's why I was like, this is something that speaks to me very personally. That the history of it has really been now very much established. How there was significant support from the United States and the CIA for the military dictatorship in Brazil to come to be established and then also to maintain itself. So now let's run through I'm just going to talk about the attention level and the trust level. So in the same way that for conspiratory beliefs to spread, there needs to be the suitable attentional networks. For real conspiracies not to be hidden, it's the same thing. What you do is you engineer the attentional networks to hide the evidence. So this is how you can do it. Censorship, easiest one, or easiest, I don't know. But familiar one. Classifying documents, right, like this, and like they have documents, but you can't read anything. Avoiding paper trail, like to destroy whatever evidence there was. Flooding the zone with shit. You're probably familiar with this expression, right? So the idea you throw so much stuff in that it confuses everybody. And so the attentional network is so overwhelmed that people then don't really see the evidence that would be incriminated. Okay. Planting false counter evidence. Right? Another that has also been discussed today. Even eliminating compromising sources. And eliminating just means killing people. Right? That's what happens many times. We know of many real life examples of that. So that would be at the attentional level. What about at the trust level? At the trust level, it has to do with discrediting dissenters and whistleblowers. So if the evidence to be hidden leaks, right, despite your best efforts at the attention level to hide it, say it leaks, then the conspirator can still resort to strategies to silence those exposing the conspiracy by attacking their reputation and credibility. And here are some techniques that you have for this. For example, destitution of political power. And here, this is really something that what really happened in Brazil. Right? So there was this military coup in '64. Right before that, there were some members of parliament. There was a parliamentary inquiry going on to investigate the interference, right, from the United States in Brazilian politics. And all of these members of parliament who were involved in that parliamentary inquiry were completely sidelined. And they lost their mandates, they had to go in exile, they just, some of them were just killed. So that's one way you could do, just, take political power away from the people who are exposing the conspiracy. Attribution of spurious interests. You say, well, you're saying this just because you have an agenda, right? You're not being honest here. You're saying this, it's not true what you're saying. You're saying this because you have a spurious interests here. Another one is just challenges to integrity. You can just say, well, this is a subversive individual, right? And this happened both in dictatorships to the left and dictatorships to the right. That's a typical familiar way of discrediting a particular source. Or character assassination, right? You paint this whole horrible picture about this person, and then nobody's gonna take them seriously. So all this is happening again at my second level, right, in my model. And ultimately, I'm almost done. So what you have is in a way you have a 2x2 matrix where you have 4 places, and the 2 parameters are whether belief is real or not real. And I know, so many problems with that, right? I'm assuming some kind of straightforward notion of truth and reality, and I know it's more complicated than that, but just for the purposes of illustration. And then salience and non-salience. And what happens is ideally you want, this is where they're aligned and this is where they're aligned, right? That the things the contents that are real, that kind of represent the world, actually, they're also made salient. Then it's okay, things like the earth is round, what is what, etc. But what you have is when beliefs that are not real but are made salient, are promoted, that's where the conspiracy theories that promote, let's just call it false content, right, with all the scaffolds that you may want. And then when, here again we have discrepancy when there are beliefs that are true, but they're not made salient, they're hidden, right, in the epistemic environment. And this is where you have the second category that I was talking about. And then of course, when it's not real and not salient, this is the stuff that nobody cares about because it's just not relevant and it's not made salient. Okay? So it's really these 2 places of discrepancy. This is where it's kind of where you can engineer the epistemic environment in such a way so as to make true content hidden and false content to make it safe. I'm running out of time. I'm already over time. Just to conclude, right? So this model, this 3-tiered model, highlights the roles of attention, trust, and engagement in this belief forming process. That's the whole selling point of the model. Then the whole take that I'm proposing is this, that there should be primary focus on epistemic environments over individuals. So it's a much more structural approach than what you see, for example, in this kind of virtue epistemology literature on conspiracy theories. The model that I presented offers a general conceptual framework that explains how conspiratorial beliefs can arise and spread, but also it can explain how real conspiracies can be hidden, right? How the strategies that real conspirators use to hide incriminating evidence also operate at these three levels, right? At the level of epistemic environments and relations of trust and attention. And with this, I conclude. Thank you.